Well, welcome back, everybody. We've got a record number of questions in the Q&A box today, and I tried to spend a little bit of time during the break collating the questions thematically, since we certainly won't have time to go through all of them systematically, but there certainly were some common themes. And I know that they're themes that today's distinguished guests are prepared to address just by the general orientation of the topic of their book. So I'm just going to start throwing them out there. Obviously, we had a lot of questions about economic matters, some of which come out of specific things from the Baha'i writings, others that are more general. So I'm going to put a bunch of the questions together, give it to you, and offer it to you to respond to. We had a question about your thoughts about the idea of a single global currency, as well as your thoughts on how to improve the current monetary and banking systems in the world. There was also some interest in how other economies can expand like China has over the last 20 years, and how they can improve their own conditions. And if it's not too much to just put in this chunk of questions, people were also asking about that thing that you alluded to about evaluating economies in terms of people's sense of happiness and fulfillment in those economies. So with that arc of questions, I'd like to ask you to just jump into whatever stands out for you.
Let me get started on some of the economic side very briefly. On the issue of a common global currency, I think that is something that will gradually evolve. It is not something that I would regard myself as a high priority. Although, as you know, the Europeans are experimenting. There are 18, 19 countries that are members of the Euro area. Spain is one of them. We use the Euro, and there is a European Central Bank that coordinates monetary policy at the level of the Euro area. So that experiment is very, very interesting. And I think that one of the lessons that comes from the last 20 years is that to take that experiment to a global scale will take a long, long time. We're not yet ready for it, for technical reasons and other structural reasons, which I don't have the time to go into. But I myself, of course, have no doubt that in a fully integrated global economy in the future, where we have reduced some of the disparities which are characteristic today, that will become a reality. I am very sympathetic to the notion that we need to rethink our notion of what constitutes success in terms of economic policy. I think implicit in the question is the idea that that economics should be concerned less with how to add to the physical dimension of the economic system and more with the long-term welfare of the community, which the system is intended to serve, right? The reference to happiness, human happiness, I think is very well taken. And interestingly, a very distinguished Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics, has done a lot of very creative work looking at what he calls subjective well-being, but which in everyday jargon is basically human happiness. And the insight that comes of that research is something that perhaps we, members of the Baha'i community who have sort of become familiar with the principles and the guidance provided in the faith on the issue of economics would understand, which is basically that money and resources matter a great deal when you are making the transition from extreme poverty, to becoming sort of middle class, right? So having more money when you don't have certainty about where the next meal for your children is going to come from is tremendously important, and it adds to happiness. But there comes a point when, once your basic necessities have been fulfilled, where the sources of happiness shift, and they depend less on how much money you earn and how the material goods that you possess, and they begin to depend on relationships, on job satisfaction, on other non-material aspects of life. And I think that's a very profound insight, and it says a great deal about how we should reorganize our economic system in a way, as I said before, that places less emphasis, for instance, on military hardware and puts more emphasis on safety net, on security, on nutrition, on access to public health for everybody, and so on. To the extent that we do that, I think we will have a happier population and a better economy. This is a vast subject, and I'm sure Maja and Arthur have other things to contribute as well. Thank you. Thank
you, Augusto. I'd love to hear from you. Arthur, go ahead.
Well, thinking with that reference about the countries growing, you can have growth purely in the sense of the economy, but we know that there are limits. You can't keep growing forever. And, no elephant grows forever. We should be looking at optimal sizes and not constantly growing, and then recognize that in a mature civilization where you may not want to keep growing in terms of material consumption because resources are limited and have to have a more circular economy, you can keep growing in art and culture and beauty and science and knowledge and all sorts of other things that are really much more important once you reach that point, as Augusto said, where your basic needs are met, where you don't have to struggle. And certainly, in those countries that have sort of fallen behind, part of it is because they're still subject to what you might colonial exploitation, although now it's more multinational exploitation, but extracting resources rather than bringing wealth into the country. You also need much better education, especially of women, so that everybody can be constructive. And then you need to have good governance. Unfortunately, many of the countries that are farther behind also fail in terms of the quality of governance and the levels of corruption and other things, so that there are a series of things that must be changed to create the basis for building a society and economy at the national level that can meet everybody's needs successfully. Those will be some of the obstacles out of the way. Then you'll be able to achieve an appropriate level of growth until you reach a balance with everything else. But one other point, I think, was one point about the voting. We considered more radical proposals for voting, like, wouldn't it be wonderful if your weight of votes in the general depended on how sustainable your economy was, or how happy your people were, how much well-being you had in the economy, and how much you had in terms of equality between men and women, between different racial groups and so on. Those would be the incentives to increase your voting share by doing the right things instead of growing your economy or growing your population to get more votes. But we felt that was just too radical for what we were doing at this point. We didn't think we were ready for that. But ultimately, we'd like to see a whole different way of looking at what makes a country stand out in the world and worth having a bigger voice. A few other comments to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Maja, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add a few thoughts in terms of, improving the overall economic kind of financial frameworks at the international level. There was a positive new recent step negotiated within the frame of the G7 about imposing a global minimum corporate tax and also adjusting the rules for the taxation of multinational companies at the international level to try to, try to sensibly, reasonably capture some of this extraordinary wealth that we have under traditional measures, capture some of this extraordinary abundance we have, so that everyone, pays their fair share in taxes. I'm just mentioning that because this is so vitally important, and hopefully there will be more steps taken, around issues such as tax havens. The Global Governance Forum and three of us have been supporting efforts towards establishing an international anti-corruption court. Also, so much money is lost on an annual basis through corruption. So these are also dimensions of our global economic system that it seems like, okay, finally some leaders are waking up to seeing like how vital they are to, again, have just a more sensibly ordered global economic system according to the very conventional metrics. Now, moving on to the GDP sort of debate, absolutely echo what both Augusto and Arthur have said about, there are shifting paradigms, thankfully, towards, trying to think about human well-being. But just to add to that, the ecological costs of our economic activity the natural ecosystem services that are provided that we've been destroying and undermining, the use of new virgin resources rather than having really intensively circular economies where everything is used and reused and cycled back through your economy. All of these have to, they absolutely fundamentally have to change. Like, this huge shift has to happen so that we remain within planetary boundaries. So there are going to be all sorts of these different paradigm shifts which will simply have to happen, whether we like it or not, I think. So, I mean, it's an exciting time, but it's also sort of a complicated and pioneering time also for academics and economists to try to chart our future in a healthy way. And yeah, I can only hope that human well-being is really centered. I know, New Zealand, for example, has started to try to include that in their metrics. Bhutan, I think, has famously also tried to do so. So hopefully that will also expand more and more.
Right. And, it's very heartening to hear you talk about the fact that, at least some nucleus of world leaders is beginning to be excited about thinking along these lines, and that, you're seeing people experimenting with new ideas and different ways of doing things. Let me just bring in a few sort of isolated topics. To some extent, you guys have touched on a number of them, but they're harder to package into one question. And one thing, a clarification question came in to you, Arthur, that asked that you could further explain your comment on voting. But I want to add to that some questions that have come in about the purpose or the worth of veto power in the UN system. So if you could sort of maybe link those together and you all could comment on those two topics, that would be great.
Certainly, with respect to the veto, it was incorporated, you might say, at the insistence of Stalin when Roosevelt was trying to get the United Nations Charter approved. And Stalin said, I'll vote for anything so you don't interfere with what I'm doing within my own country. And of course, Roosevelt knew that he had to get the US Senate to approve this. And Wilson had failed with the League of Nations. And he said, unless there's some kind of iron safeguard for American interests, the Senate won't vote for it. And so it was really the victors of World War II that kept to themselves the veto power as the way of making it acceptable to the more extreme. But it's totally contrary to the UN Charter. It sort of means that 5 countries are above the law. And but every attempt to remove it have failed because, of course, it's subject to the veto. And the clause on revision of the Charter is also subject to the veto. So those countries have always succeeded, prevented any kind of change in the Charter that might actually remove that. So that's the problem with the veto. It shouldn't be there. It was there for practical reasons 20 years ago, and we've suffered ever since. My question about voting is that if you rank countries' voting power on the basis of the size of their economy, then clearly the more you grow your economy, the more the power you get. Of course, economies can't grow forever. It's the wrong measure. There's a limit to how before the growth now is based on the destruction of our natural resources. We're consuming much more than what the planet is regenerating. So it's unsustainable. So ideally, you'd want a voting system that would reward good behavior rather than sort of rewarding bad behavior. Which is why I was like the idea that the more sustainable a country had become as playing its role as a good citizen should increase its voice in some moderate way, in the same way that the more that it is focusing on bringing well-being to all of its citizens and reduced inequality, that might be another better measure to encourage countries to go in the direction of a better world civilization. So lots of things we need to question old assumptions as we look in new directions, and it will take time to bring these in. As Augusto mentioned with respect to the global series, these are things, we have this vision in the Baha'i faith of what needs to be done, and we say, how do we move quickly where we can now, where it's essential because of the environmental crisis? Where will it take a bit longer because we need a deeper spiritual understanding? We're ready to accept these values as part of the new paradigm, the civilization we're trying to build. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting historical footnote on the veto. which I learned when we were doing the research for this book. It turns out that the United States did not use the veto power once during practically the first 20, 25 years of the history of the United Nations. I think it was only in the early 70s or late 60s that they used it for the first time. By then, the Soviet Union had used the veto power dozens and dozens of times, and mainly to block the entry into the United Nations of nations that were not to the liking of the Soviet mentality. So they would prevent and they would delay and so on. So it's an interesting footnote. Although what Arthur said about Stalin and Roosevelt and the US Senate is absolutely, completely correct.
Thank you. Maya, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, maybe just to supplement the points about the veto, which indeed has hamstrung, like it's been such an operational impediment for the Security Council to be effective in its role to safeguard international peace and security, to serve as the apex executive organ of the UN. And like it's really hampered its functional operations. But just also to sort of give a counterexample of the European Union, no one state within the European Union has or a little tiny group of states has a veto power. France and Germany, or the bigger economies, don't have any kind of special veto powers within the European Union. It's meant to be a community, a collection of peers, more or less. So just to say that there are more mature, evolved, modern governance systems that the UN could look to, because it's also often seen as such a huge challenge. Oh, why would a country ever give up its veto power? It's such a wonderful thing. Well, if it could be a much more functional organization, it would be according to much more modern, sane standards of governance legitimacy. So there are other examples. Go ahead, Augusto. Did you have a supplementary point?
Something that Maya said reminded me. In our book, actually, we have a very detailed proposal as to how to reorganize the Security Council. And essentially, we propose to move to a system in which every country is represented, not the current system where you have some permanent members with the veto power and a few others which rotate. In our system, it's based on much sounder principles of representative and democracy. And obviously, we do away with the veto power. But this is a more detailed discussion, which is in one of the chapters in the book. Thank you.
Okay. One question that's coming up that I think is really interesting and is really important to be able to answer. Your book is sort of directed towards people who work in the global governance sector, but everyday people want to know what they can do too. People who aren't actors, and operatives in the global governance system care about these issues. They want to do their part. What are your thoughts about how individuals can make a difference in the evolution of the kinds of ideas and practices that your book puts forth?
Arthur, do you want to take a crack?
Well, I think the foundation of all of this is the oneness of humanity, recognizing that we're all part of the same human family and need to, at all levels, organize ourselves as part of a single family. And those are the values that start in the family and that start in the local community. And therefore, we can already be learning good governance practices at this level. And as they're seen to be more successful, then they will gradually filter up to other levels. The Baha'is have a whole program, of core activities and community building, saying we need to rebuild, the whole of civilization on a new set of values from the bottom up. And as they demonstrate their success all around the world, that will create a spirit of cooperation and unity and wanting to share and contribute and wanting to apply these principles that we've defined at the highest level. Of course, that's going to take time, which is why even in the Baha'i faith recognize that some of these first steps towards world peace, and some of them will happen before the Baha'is have that universal influence. And the fruit from that will come later. But a lot of already now we're starting to build the foundations. And then I think the other thing is where young people picking a career can say, is there a career that I can pick that will help to contribute to solving some problem of the world? That's what I did in my case as a Baha'i, saying, where do I find a path of service which has allowed me to gradually rise to the level where I can make old contributions. And many young people will be able to do the same thing today. So depending on where you are in your life, you can be more or less ambitious. But all of that would be ways in which each individual can find their place and way of contributing.
That's good advice. Maja, go ahead.
Yeah. Also, sort of on the sort of global governance discussion level, a colleague of ours on the Global Governance Forum has developed a set of discussion questions for communities and groups if people want to host a discussion on the reform proposals in the book. So I think that can be a very interesting way to engage with others on thinking about, what more effective global governance would look like, to share ideas. And then I think, of course, at the policy level, there's always discussions that people can start with various different policymakers at all levels to just inquire, and talk about global risks, our shared global challenges, to talk about international cooperation and the importance of international cooperation. There was this amazing UN survey around the world for the 75th anniversary, and they had a company do objective interviews with populations around the world, and the vast majority really believed and supported international cooperation, knew it was vital and so crucial. So what you're saying, Layli, about people wanting to get involved, this is like a global feeling. So I think we indeed need to find more ways to involve citizens around the world in thinking about these issues. And this 10,000 conversations, we have some documents. If anybody wants to reach out, we can share those to have conversations. And you had mentioned book clubs. Some groups have started book clubs. And again, engaging with policymakers at all levels of governance to talk about our shared challenges and our shared values, our commonalities is an important thing too.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And maybe you can share the contact information with Josefina as a central point of contact in case other people write back and want to make that connection to that material. I think that's great. We're getting into our last few minutes, so I'm just going to maybe ask one more question. We actually had someone who did write in from the Marshall Islands, and they say that they're in a country that will most likely disappear with sea level rise, and they want to know your thoughts regarding environmental refugees and how we're going to deal with this issue over time. So I think that your whole system maybe could help us think about this question. So maybe that'll be our last question.
Well, as a specialist on small islands, and I've been to the Marshall Islands, and I know Carol Curtis, and I've worked with the island countries and warned them for decades of this coming threat. What do you do when, because of our human activities, you destroy an entire national territory and leave its citizens without a country? Mm-hmm. This is what we're creating today. A number of countries are in that situation where they're threatened by sea level rise, and the whole national country could disappear within decades. And obviously, they will become environmental refugees. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, I think this touches, there was also the question about migration and so on. It's clear within we're going to see masses of people moving around the world. As the tropics get warmer, some places become uninhabitably hot. It'd be impossible to live without air conditioning and other artificial controls. You couldn't go outside without dying from heat stroke. So, and that, again, this is part of the oneness of humanity, acknowledging we're all part of the same family. If some are suffering, we have to be able to take them in and find places for them, as you would with, if a family member had their house burned down, you would bring them into your home and house them until they could find something else and help them. So in the same way, if there are these victims of our own misuse of our planet and of the sources, we need to find them places. And in the same way, if all these countries that have aging populations and are worried about the future and yet refuse to accept beautiful young black workers from Africa, it's ridiculous. America was built on immigration, on migration. Australia, many of the countries that are the wealthy were built on migrants. And this could be all part of a richer and more successful mixing of peoples around the world and building wonderful new acknowledging all the things we have to contribute to each other. So it just should be something as positive. It's a tragedy when you lose your nation and your culture, but it can also be part of the enrichment of the whole world system as we accept it as a positive thing and rather than something negative to fight against.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in the last little bit of time that we have, I want to invite each of you just to make a very brief closing statement, a few sentences that you'd like to make sure that our audience goes away with today. And I think that I'll go in the order of authorship on the book. So I'll start with you, Augusto. What's your takeaway message for viewers?
Thank you, Layli. You know that one of the satisfactions of having engaged in this project with Maja and with Arthur is not only that we have brought sort of our complementary experiences and talents on a project that was very large in scope, and I think none of us could have done on our own, you know, at the individual level. And so for me anyway, that experience of working with both of them has been very enriching. And one of the things that you always want when you write a book of this nature is that it will have a long shelf life, right? In a sense, you would like it to be relevant and topical, you know, for at least many years. And I think that this is actually something that will happen, perhaps less as a result of our insight and competence, and more as a result of the fact that we have identified a set of global issues, which I think are going to be on the forefront for many, many years to come. Mm-hmm. Partly because of inertia, partly because of lack of leadership, partly because we don't seem to be able to move into action until we're really, really down to the wire, and we are, you know, with the sword over our heads. Mm. In fact, in one of the last chapters of the book, we present some scenarios in which we address this issue, you know, directly head on. So, unfortunately for us, but perhaps ironically, fortunately for the authors, this book will have a very long shelf life.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Thank you. Arthur?
Well, I think, you know, for me, we should be very thankful, those of us who know about the Baha'i faith and Baha'i principles, that we have the guidance for the future, that we have these wonderful principles, the wonderful concepts, and the more we can apply them in all the different challenges that we're facing in life, the more we'll find the right path forward. And we tried in the book to take, you know, some of these concepts and say, how would they apply to the problems of governance at the global level? And can we map some of the next steps forward? And I think if everybody has that possibility, if wherever you are, you know, it's the touchstone of truth. You know, does it resonate with Baha'i principles? How do you apply this concept in some abstract, in some particular problem you're facing, and it will give you the right path forward. And so that can give us all hope that we know we're going in the right direction.
Thank you. Maja, what are your last words for our audience?
Yeah, just maybe circling back to some of my comments at the very beginning, just to again underline the extraordinary vision of many people, you know, early in the construction of our current international order, what amazing vision they had, what amazing aspirations, what goodwill they had for all of humanity. So this is dating back to, you know, 1899, 1907, when there were the first Hague Peace Conferences. So just to say that very deep in the international system, in our collective sort of corpus of treaties, international law, the Charter, are these beautiful, beautiful, very sound ideas. So just to say that this extraordinary vision is there, you know, foundations planted by those who have come before us, and then now, you know, as Augusto was saying, we have these set of huge challenges, which are then also an opportunity. And now also populations around the world are much more aware of their interdependence. Youth are so much more connected across the world. The pandemic has raised our awareness about how interdependent we are. Climate change is just a huge challenge we're going to have to work on together. So, and just to connect one more dot, again, like with all the people who have joined this call, it's so wonderful that people are engaged and passionate, and we should just keep talking about these issues and keep talking about, what we need to do at the global level. And the power of international citizens is also very remarkable. In the last 20 to 30 years or so, we've had these amazing achievements of just citizen groups around the world helping to establish the International Criminal Court, working on the UN Convention for persons with disabilities, for the nuclear weapons prohibition treaty, et cetera. Like, these are extraordinary accomplishments that have been driven by citizens. So just to say that there are also these extremely positive forces that are at work, and that they're amongst all of us. So yeah, we just all have to stay engaged and keep talking to each other and understanding our global interdependence.
Well, thank you. That's a very inspiring note to end on. And I certainly want to thank all of you again, Augusto, Arthur, and Maja, for appearing on today's show and taking time to discuss these vitally important topics. I also want to thank my co-host, Derik Smith, and naturally, I want to thank every member of the audience, one and all, for joining us in today's conversation. We hope to see you again next time. Thank you.